Joining me now, Major Chris Hunter, former British Army officer, and Bob Seeley, Conservative MP, a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and also a former soldier himself. Good afternoon to you both. Chris Hunter, first of all, I mean, the Houthi statement perhaps to be expected, but I mean, this hardly came out of nowhere. This was about self-defence and retaliation, right? Simple as that. To coin a phrase, they started it.
That's absolutely right, Ian. I mean, I'm broadcasting from Iraq at the moment. I'm two kilometres away from Erbil Air Station and Erbil International Airport, one of the coalition bases here in the region. There's American and British troops there. We've seen since October the 7th well in excess of 100 drone and rocket strikes on those coalition bases. And just yesterday, we saw more drone strikes here at the airport. Just before Christmas, I was on a flight trying to get home, and the airport was struck with 3 drones. And these are sizable drones; they're the size of car bombs, basically. So, yeah, not surprising at all that they've come back with that rhetoric. And I think it's not before time that we have actually, pulled our socks up and actually responded meaningfully.
Of course, the question everybody is asking now, and it's hard to give a specific answer, but I suppose best guess territory from a military perspective, if you could, Chris, where does it go next? Because the smart money would suggest that they are now going to retaliate to this. They've said as much.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a cat and mouse. Unfortunately, it is countermeasure in terms of race and technology, and it's cat and mouse in terms of, who's like tit for tat, basically. We're going to see some sort of response. Normally what would happen when it comes to airstrikes and targeted surgical strikes is that you would go for the radar stations, the surveillance target acquisition capabilities of the enemy, and then you'd go for the air defense systems, and then you could go to attack the other, fuel depots, all the other sort of strikes and targets that we saw last night. What they're basically going to do is grind down the command and control aspects of the Houthis, if required, and of course the logistics and the actual combat capabilities, if you like. But as President Biden said, as our Prime Minister said, Rishi Sunak, it's not going to be, a huge escalatory war. It's going to be measured responses, I think.
Yeah. And it's worth saying, and I don't think much has been said about this really, but our men and women that were up in those planes at night over very dangerous skies, I mean, this is a highly skilled job, right? I mean, this isn't a case of willy-nilly taking off in a plane and dropping. I mean, this really does require some proper strategic thinking. And it is an act of incredible bravery as well. War is not easy.
It's not, it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of coordination as well. You don't just have an aircraft taking off and hitting a target. There's a whole raft of support, combat arms and combat support services, in the land, sea, and in the air, that support those and work in that 3-dimensional battle space, if you like. So, and of course, as you've alluded there, the skill, expertise, and courage of the pilots and those supporting them is phenomenal. Yeah, it's really exemplary behaviour.
Indeed. Bob Seeley, good to have you with us, Bob. I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, I think this largely has cross-party support. Keir Starmer has backed the statement of the Prime Minister. There are one or two stragglers at the back who think Parliament should be recalled. Do you share that view?
No, I'm all for having a debate on it, and I'm sure there'll be a statement on Monday afternoon. And if need be, one can have debates on this because it's important that Parliament's involved. Having said that, the government can't sit and wait for Parliament to give its say-so to every time it considers military action overseas. So I don't buy that argument. And actually, just to back up something that Chris was saying, I was talking to a mate who's actually spends a lot of his time at Erbil Airport in the Kurdish section of Iraq. And I think he's up there at the moment. And I think that it's very, very underreported. But the amount of enemy fire that's coming in via drones, via rockets, I think is relatively intense. And the only reason we don't hear more about it is because there's a very, very complex layer of air defense, which is stopping most of those drones and most of those missiles getting through. But my worry is at any time, if one of those gets through and hits the wrong building in the Erbil area, you can have a lot of either UK or US casualties.
Yeah. And that is, I mean, all about the delicacy of war. And it is despite the obvious brutality of what sometimes has to happen, it is simultaneously a very delicate procedure as well. Things have to be done correctly.
Yeah.
And one wrong move
Yeah,
can change the entire course of what is happening.
Yes, look, I mean, I'm just from what I can see from my perspective, I think what the government seems to be doing, the Americans seem to be doing, and clearly they're talking to their partners, most closely, probably in this case, the Saudis, is that they are showing the Houthis that you can't just trash commercial shipping, you can't just bomb commercial shipping, you can't just sink commercial shipping, but at the same time, there is a peace process or a ceasefire and peace process in relation to Yemen ongoing, and clearly we don't want to be scuppering that.
Yeah.
So it's about having some kind of carrot in the sense of having a peace process in train. And clearly the Saudis are wanting to pull back from this difficult war that they've been in, this difficult campaign in Yemen. And there has been criticism of some of their targeting, whilst at the same time not giving the Houthis a free rein. There is one slightly stepping back from this, Ian. What we're seeing now is Iranian proxies active against international shipping in UK and the US in the Red Sea, through which 12% of global trade goes, firstly. Secondly, their proxies in Iraq doing what they can to target UK and US forces, especially in northern Iraq, if I understand correctly. And thirdly, clearly, you've got Hamas operational in a highly significant way against Israel. And so you've got, Iran has really raised its level of aggression via Hamas, excuse me, via the Houthis and via their Iranian proxy. So Iran is effectively at war with parts of the Western world, and certainly wanting to internationalize the crisis by shutting down the Red Sea.
And of course, Chris, it's inevitable people will, not wishing to exaggerate the situation, but this widens out tensions, doesn't it, in the Middle East? I mean, there's a lot going on. Saudi Arabia and Yemen have sort of found this very delicate ceasefire situation. But of course, we have Israel and Gaza going on. Now we have this. We have Iran, who, clearly seem to be these puppeteers of a lot of these groups, although the Houthis are, a particularly large group and very dominant in their own territory. Is this ultimately really a war with Iran, or is it a war with the Houthis, do you sense, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bob summarised it very well there, and I'm fully in agreement. It's very much a case here that Iran within the Middle East is the key player and the key antagonist. Virtually all of the military capability of the Houthis, for example, and let's not underestimate them either. I mean, their anti-ship missiles, their ballistic missiles, their drone capability, it's capable, the combined firepower is capable of reaching parts of the Mediterranean, it's capable of reaching Africa, and it's capable of covering pretty much the entire Middle East. That's quite a significant threat. Bob also mentioned there the Iranian-backed militias, the Popular Mobilization Forces, as they call themselves here in Iraq. They are significant. They form the majority of every time I go out as a humanitarian deminer, I have to go through their checkpoints. Just a few weeks ago, I had my passport taken off of me for about 20 minutes to make sure I wasn't American. Now that's probably going to change now, because it's very clear that the United Kingdom is in absolute solidarity and support with the United States in this particular issue. I suspect next time I get stopped at a checkpoint, it's going to be a very, very different story for me. So on a personal level, I'm really seeing it. But I think there's a very, very high likelihood that we're going to see other key players as well. And it really all depends on how we respond, from the West as any sort of coalition. We've got to be really careful. It's very, very easy for us to interpret Middle Eastern culture through a Western lens. Yep. And I've lived here for 5 years now. I'm not a backpacker. I haven't come out here for a couple of weeks to Dubai and thought I'm an expert on the Middle East. I live and work with these people. They're my friends. And in some cases, they're my enemies. I got shot 20 years ago by some extremists in the Middle East as well. In the Middle East, you see a predisposition towards tribe and family. You see a predisposition towards country. You see a predisposition towards religion. And those dependencies, those loyalties shift and change on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day. And it's very, very hard and very, very complex. There's a lot of variables to understand what is going through the minds of these people strategically, operationally, and tactically. So it's very, very difficult, and we have to be careful of what we do.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that, Chris. And I wonder, Bob, whether, and a previous guest did allude to this, that I wouldn't say appetite, but maybe understanding of what inverted commas are called foreign wars. Has that changed somewhat? I think 20 years ago, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Somebody attacks you, in you go. Since then, we've seen what happened in Iraq. Subsequently, the very end of Iraq, of course, we've seen Afghanistan. The public appetite and the appetite, perhaps, Bob, of many of your colleagues is perhaps different today than it would have been. There is a lot of understandable reservation about where this goes next. Final point.
Yes, for sure. Look, war changes over decades, from decade to decade, and how we react and how we behave changes as well. I think there was less public desire for any overseas action maybe a few years ago when you had the Syria vote, which I think was probably a mistake. And I think now we're getting back into a sense of some equilibrium. I do think having large-scale Western forces in Middle Eastern countries with hindsight was a mistake. And I think since the end of the Iraq War, I think we have taken a more sensible approach, which is to ensure that we support our allies and our proxies effectively in the region, whether that's nation-state allies like the Saudis, or whether it's working with Syrian Kurds, or whether we're working with Iraqi Kurdish forces as well, or indeed Iraqi Arabs as well now increasingly. We are much better providing niche capabilities and using that and special forces and ISTAR assets like surveillance and very high-end drones with training and with other specialized resources, and then working with proxies as ground forces, then we are supplying those ground forces ourselves. So I don't think we're anywhere back to those days of putting ground forces or significant regular forces on the ground in the Middle East. What we might be doing is now seeing an up-tempo where we put more expert capability, maybe some more ships, maybe some more, a bit of an SF laydown or an ISTAR laydown, and working with other nations to work more closely with nation-state allies, but also potentially the Kurds in northern Iraq as well, who have been very good allies, one should remember, for a very long time.